Welcome to Soft Network. Today we have Dr. Diego Hernandez. Doc Diego is a nationally recognized clinical psychologist, trauma researcher, and human performance consultant with over 25 years of experience serving the Special Operation Forces, Army Behavioral Health, elite performers, and veterans. He is a contributing member of the Soft Network and the lead investigator on clinical projects where he helps advance collaborative research to improve psychological care and resilience for soft communities. Doc Diego is a former clinical director of military trauma research at the University of South Florida and former research consultant with the Mayo Clinic, supporting clinical trials and program development for post-traumatic stress, grief, and cancer-related distress. With over 20 peer-reviewed publications, he has helped shape trauma-informed practices across military, medical, and performance domains. Dr. Hernandez has collaborated extensively with Lieutenant Colonel Scott Mann, combining their expertise in leadership and trauma to deliver veteran storytelling initiatives, leadership workshops, and rooftop leadership retreats. He is currently touring with Scott and Last
Out.
Last Out, as well as Scott's new play on Operation Pineapple Express called 11 Days. It premieres in Tampa December 17th. Their shared mission is to bring the lessons of the battlefield into boardroom, classrooms, and communities, helping people lead themselves and others through adversity with clarity and courage. Dr. Hernandez continues this work through his Tampa-based practice, where he coaches warriors, executives, and teams in emotional agility, embodied awareness, and high-performance decision-making. His current focus is clarity in military transition and navigating life transitions. He works by, with, and through with high-performing professionals, athletes, and soft warriors in transition. Diego, thanks for coming on today.
Oh, it's a pleasure.
I want to go back because I typically don't have the opportunity. I usually do these ahead of time, but being able to do the intro with you here, remind me, when's the first time we had contact?
So interestingly enough, it was last year, probably August. And so I reached out to you because I went through the retreat program at Ambio with a group of operators. And as I was kind of reorienting myself and plugging in with their program, they actually are the ones who mentioned the Soft Network, and they're like, "Well, they're in Tampa," and I'm like, "Dude, I'm in Tampa." It's like it's right there, and then that's when we connected. It was very organic.
Okay. Yeah, I couldn't remember the linkage, but I appreciate you reminding me. Yeah, Diego and I, good night. We've met for coffee. We've shared a couple different opportunities to work together, and I can't speak enough about you. You've just been a huge blessing in my life. Opportunity to bounce ideas off you, get some wisdom and feedback over the last year, and so I just personally want to thank you for investing in me and obviously Soft Network, because having somebody of your background and caliber is just, I'll say, as a younger academic, so helpful to be able to look up and ask questions along the way. So thank you.
My pleasure. It's a real joy. It's like, the amount of time that I've spent working with folks in the special operations community and just realizing that there's such a need. One of the conversations that you and I had was talking with some of the folks with the selection process for Top Gun. And one of the things that I continuously like to point out is that you have these groups of individuals who go through these rigorous selection processes and then have to continuously train and maintain. So you have these elite warfighters, the elite of the elite, and then you just pull any therapist or psychologist off the shelf and say, okay, go fix them. And so what you do is you take the outlier here, and you give them the average therapist. What's the average therapist going to do? It's like we only take people as far as we go. So they're going to try to bring this person down to where they're at, and there needs to be a selection process. And I feel like the Soft Network is meeting that need by venting therapists, providing training, providing support, so that way we can continue to operate at the similar capacity with the folks that we work with. They're exceptional individuals who need, exceptional time, effort, resources, tools, and the standard things do not work. So I'm just so grateful that you're doing it. I mean, it's something that the need was there, but with my hands doing so many different things, I could never really do what you do. So, of course, any way that I can continue to support the network and support what you do, it's just, it's something essential to my mission. It's something I'm proud to be part of.
I appreciate it. Yeah, I think that point that you brought up about, we'll just say average or normal clinicians working with special people. Dr. Noble pointed this out. I think it was in episode 2 when I interviewed him, the former Ranger Regiment psychologist. We were talking about, these individuals are generally one standard deviation intelligence above
Right.
the normal. And Dr. Blair was talking, Blair Cano was talking about this on one of our monthly calls the other day. If we don't advocate and help people realize, and of course the clinicians within our network know this, but I'll say other clinicians, when you meet these individuals, their baseline is much higher than the average person. And so that's
Right.
just one of that cultural competency pieces that you've got to understand, that this is just a different human being. To overuse the word special or just different, however you want to describe it, their baseline is just vastly different from what you typically work with. And so having that is critical right out of the gate. Otherwise, like you said, you're dragging them back down to a level that they don't operate at.
Yeah, and it's also one of the things that, early on, in the whole GWAT era, the Army in particular recognized that, you know the the operators are performing at this high level, that they took a bunch of Green Berets and said, "Hey, who wants to become sports psychologists?" And really started cultivating this idea of the tactical athlete, and using some of the same resources. And that's why, some of the same facilities and stuff now that work with injured NFL players and stuff work with injured active duty. And it's like it's a sharing of resources, especially around TBI and other things like that too. It's like, because people who are pushing themselves and operating at this level, are unique in that regards. Maybe we have the same collective social and emotional needs, but some of those social and emotional needs are met with other unique individuals.
I want to take a step back because we're going to get into some of that. Give us a brief background of, kind of how you grew up, maybe some of the cultural, or relational currency that you had in your household growing up, and then obviously your connection to the military and the special operations community.
Well, we could probably spend the whole time talking about the way we grew up. Um, the play was in Virginia not too long ago, and one of the really cool things about the play is, because folks within the special operations community come to it. The play was really written. The last act was really written for civilians to kind of understand the impact of war on the military family, and really kind of speak to the story of war and the story of warriors going through it. And so many people are drawn to it, especially from the community. And I was sitting around with a bunch of retired operators, and of course it's like, you get comfortable, you're having conversations, and they're like, does childhood trauma have anything to do? I was like, dude, this is what makes like an ideal operator. It's like you have a little bit of a fucked up childhood and you have ADD, because that makes you resourceful, and it helps you to survive difficult situations and circumstances. It's like even the conversation we're having about Top Gun. You don't want the student who's turns in all their homework, who does everything on time and does everything the right way, because that person in a crisis can't really think out of the box.
Hmm.
You want somebody who can accomplish all of those things, but have a little bit of colorful experiences and background. They test the limits. They go further, and it's this. Sometimes it's this constant tension between having these outliers who keep pushing the limits and going forward, which you need them to do, but then reining everything in to kind of meet the other objectives that are going on. So having said that, I'm the son of a Vietnam veteran. I know what it's like to grow up in a home with a veteran with PTSD. So my trauma response was to become a combat trauma expert. My life's mission was to figure out trauma, and essentially help warriors come home in a way that my father couldn't.
Hmm. Around what age did that click for you? Like, when did you piece that together?
Oh, yeah. So that's a longer process. When we look at our identity and who we are, it's like one of the roles of the ego is to create these avatars, which is our identity. This is like where imposter syndrome comes in. It's like I was just working with somebody the other day, and they're like, it's like my imposter syndrome is kicking up, and I was like, well, of course, because you're not that person.
Hmm.
It's not who you are. That's who you're becoming. You're becoming a version of that, but you're not that person. Sometimes that feedback that we get is saying it's basically telling us that we don't have what we need, so that way we can seek what we need. Along those lines, some of our early personalities that we kind of shape, from childhood, is based on the needs that were met, as well as some of the needs that were not met. And some of my needs that were not met, I was, hell bent on figuring it out.
Hmm.
When it comes to emotion and memory and stuff, I was going to figure it out. I was going to overcome these things. I was going to master my emotions. I was going to control things, and I was going to go and figure it out to help people perform at their best, so they don't come home in a kind of a fucked up way.
Hmm.
And in the whole process of my journey, what I've learned is all those things that I tried to overcome are the very things that I needed to learn to embrace.
Yeah, the chaos of emotions, the
Yeah.
chaos of maybe the environment, as opposed to, which makes sense, right? If I can control it, then I can calm myself down, because the stimuli that I'm encountering may be activating my nervous system. But to your point, that's a fallacy, and it's super unhelpful in life if we're constantly just controlling everything, as opposed to, no, there's times where we need to feel out of control and deal with that.
Well, yeah, absolutely. That leads into a couple other areas I don't want to lose scope of, but I just want to make a statement. It's like often growing up in these kind of environments where there's a degree of chaos and we're trying to find control. That one of the responses is we go into the world and create chaos, but many of us go into the world and we try to calm the chaos.
Hmm.
We go in and we want to help. It's one of the driving forces for people becoming law enforcement and firefighters and stuff. It's like, let me take all the intensity of which I know how to operate in, and let me go make it better for others. And that was a, big part of my journey in that regards too, where, led me to, basically a period of burnout where, that's why I went to the, part of the reason I went to the AMBIO program to kind of regroup and work on some of these things that were coming up, because I'd gotten to a place where I'd achieved many of the things I'd set out to achieve in life, but that internal drive for more was still there.
Hmm. Now, I know that, and we don't have to get into it too much, but for you, was that experience transformative, specifically as it gears towards your relationship towards that drive?
Oh, absolutely. Because, so one of the things that happens is that these avatars that the ego creates, these temporary selves, our sense of self is how we operate in the world. It's central to everything neurologically. And then as a result, all these pathways are built to these different skills that are associated with that sense of self. And when that sense of self is invested in a role alone, then you lose that role, you lose your sense of self. And so it's one of the things I work with folks in transition is to basically migrate those skills and resources over into this new role that you're creating. And I also study like indigenous cultures and different traditions and other things like that too, because I'm interested in what makes us the most human. Like, for example, it's like, when we were doing clinical research and training on these memory focused techniques. I'm also doing equine assisted psychotherapy, emotionally focused couples therapy. I'm training RTM. I'm training in EMDR and all these other things because I'm looking for what are the common elements that allow us to change and adapt as human beings. Like trying to answer the question of what is healing really.
Hmm.
And a lot of it in ancient cultures is about this transition of self, and they use the metaphors of life and death. Like even with the psychedelic process, they've traditionally ceremonial, where you're going through some kind of life transition, where it's a death to who you were. Like in the psychedelic community, they call it an ego death, and that can happen with or without the psychedelics because we have to sort of recognize and let go and grieve. One of the symbols that in some shamanistic traditions in regards to this process of transformation and transition is like a snake shedding its skin, or think of it like I had one of my clients the other day going, it's like, oh my God, I'm molting, because it's like they're sort of sloughing off who they were in order to become who they're becoming.
Hmm.
And so life is always a process of becoming. And if you look at just neurologically how the brain works, we go through deconsolidation and reconsolidation of memory every 24 hours. So every 24 hours, your sense of self is being updated with new information. Um, and that continues to build till you kind of cross a threshold. And then you have to shed who you were, and this is why it's so important to have a strong sense of like your essence and who you are, because we have this sense of who we are all throughout our lifespan, but our roles and our main jobs change throughout our lives. Um,
I'm assuming this is a huge part of your perspective of why so many individuals struggle going from the uniform to the civilian life is that they're holding on to that old shed.
well, yeah, because it's like, so you think about it, if you come from a difficult background, and then you gain this strong sense of self through these incredible trials, through training and experience, and you learn how to operate at this high level. You learn to function up here. It's kind of like growing up, working towards getting in the NFL. You play for a number of years, and after the Super Bowl, they drop you off in the same bad neighborhood where they first picked you up. You're like, who am I now? Um, and this is why it's really, really important to kind of know who we are apart from these roles. Like, for example, in law enforcement, people who spend their whole career in law enforcement, there's a tendency for, it's kind of like a short lifespan after they retire. And one of the main differences is people whose entire life revolves around the job, and they don't have a life outside of it. They don't have the connection and the resources. And when they lose the job, they completely lose their sense of self.
So to overly simplify this, they're identifying with something external versus something internal, something that's
Well,
temporal.
it's the internal experience of the external role,
Right.
because the role constantly gets reinforced by the job. And if people are always thanking you and you get awards and other things that are happening, it just kind of validates this sense of who you are. And if you never go beyond that, you're creating this vulnerability. It's just like bullies, right? Bullies at their core are really insecure, and so they're trying to force validation through forcing their will upon other people, because that's the feedback that they need to feel like they're in control. And often too, it's like if someone's emotionally out of control, we'll try to trigger an emotional response in somebody else, and then they're like, "Oh, okay, yeah, then now I understand." Um, what's going on, and I know that's more of the extreme, but that happens on a smaller level because we're not really cultivating this relationship with our essence. Different cultures call it like it's your soul, it's your spirit, it's other things. It's what uniquely makes you you.
Hmm. All right. Two paths that we can take. A part of my brain wants to track on some of the conversations you and I have had on transition and identity through the military. And then the other part of my brain says, hey, we should track down and talk a little bit more about emotions. Do you have a preference at this point?
Well, see, I love talking about transition and all this other stuff, and it would be fun for me to have this conversation, especially since we're working on this paper on military transition and all that too. But I think what people would benefit the most from would be a conversation around emotions and some of the stuff that you kind of had teed up for today.
What are obviously, if you spend any amount of time on social media or online and you've got, therapists that are influencers, so on and so forth, I'm not knocking them. I'm just saying there's a lot of information about emotions. Can you break down from your perspective, how do you view emotions and how do you teach clients about their emotions?
Well, so it's more about how we think about emotions and what we think they are.
Okay.
So we've been sold this idea of a lizard brain. And so it creates the impression that emotions are these things that are left over. What neuroscience is teaching us is that the lizard brain hypothesis there's no evidence to support it. So some of the mental illness hypotheses, there's very little evidence. The depression is not a chemical imbalance. There's all kinds of stuff. I mean, science is constantly updating us. But some of these ideas persist. Like when people think about how long are you supposed to wait after you eat to go in the water? It's like, and that was actually like a social convention rule that came up, and then people all of a sudden were just continuously teaching that. And so some of these ideas about emotions is that we treat emotions like symptoms, when emotions are more of a signal. There's a paper that came out recently that was talking about depression, and feeling depressed is a signal from your social networks saying that you're not as connected or engaged as much as you need to be. And this is part of the trend that's moving because our understanding of emotions. I would any therapist, I would recommend the work of Elizabeth Feldman Barrett. She's got a couple of books that are really great. There's tons of talks you can Google and listen. And she comes from what's called a constructivist view of emotions. And in her research, what they did was they replicated these famous studies, like, you go to Papua New Guinea and you teach people these American emotional concepts and then show them pictures and get them to express it. And then you say, oh, look, even these indigenous people, they have the same emotional concepts. So these are universal. Well, for one, emotions aren't universal. There tends to be these kind of universal categories, but we all experience emotions very differently and very uniquely. That emotions are actually constructed uniquely according to the categories and experiences that we've had as something applied to this moment. So rather than being this reactive lizard brain thing that's driving us towards these primal needs, that you have, for the most part, emotions as a way to try to inform us. So how an emotion is formed is your body has all of this data we call it interoceptive awareness. And the data is processed and summarized. We have an experience and interpretation of the world in our environment. So that stuff is brought in. And then what happens is it's all kind of mixed in with anything that's similar from the past. And this combines together to begin to create an emotion, which the physiology of an emotion only lasts about 90 seconds. After that, everything else is your relationship to that emotion.
So let me break this down. Let's do like a quick case study or vignette for the listeners. So let's take a male that's been abused in their childhood. Could be physically, could be sexually, could be a family member, could be somebody else. But okay, so what you're saying is, in that experience, obviously they're experiencing a sense of, let's just say, out of control, among many others. Maybe they feel unsafe. Maybe they feel taken advantage of. Maybe they feel emasculated. Let's, go down the list. But for this example, this sense of out of control, what I'm hearing you say is now they're starting to learn about that relationship or create meaning around that feeling of being out of control based on that event. That then,
Well, what happens is they react to it.
okay,
So our brain tries to simplify things, and so you think of emotions as initially reflexive. So we develop adaptive behavior around these things. So, like in this case, if somebody's been abused, one hand you may be triggering a specific event, and that's what's associated with the classical view of post-traumatic stress.
right.
But their nervous system has also been conditioned and responds a little differently. And all of our nervous systems have been conditioned. We have layers and layers and layers of experiences and identities associated with those experiences. That's why, when you work from some of these different perspectives, about your younger selves and things like that, it's like the goal is to try to integrate some of those experiences. But what I'm saying is for all of us across the board. So that emotion is also going to draw from the most salient experiences, the most salient, uncomfortable emotions and things like that too. So for some, it might trigger trauma, but for most people, it's just going to trigger discomfort, which people are going to try to avoid and seek away from it. So what happens is that your brain is creating this summary of your experience and the external data and the internal data to help you to predict what happens next. It's trying to actually guide you and guide you in a way that is kind of congruent with our essence and who we really are. So when you ignore an emotion and you block it off and you have this idea, it's like, oh, this is just my lizard brain and this is my amygdala acting up and all this other stuff. And you're trying to prevent this thing from happening. So now all of your resources are going into trying to prevent this thing from happening. Most of the time when people are caught up thinking about the past, and many of my clients, when I work with them, I get them to notice what's happening in the moment because your body is summarizing your entire experience to guide you. And if you stick with that guidance in pursuit of a goal, often the memories and other experiences just kind of resolve themselves. If you shift and just focus on the past, then you're continuously revolving around the past, seeking some answer that may or may not be there. There's some recent research that's coming out that is actually kind of demonstrating that the amount of time that therapists spend on the past is actually making people feel worse about their past. The past is only trying to guide us in the present. And so some of these trauma techniques, which, I've done them for years and they can be incredibly beneficial to move somebody from a state that they're not able to move themselves. And that's when they're really, really important. It's like when somebody can't move forward, then it's time to address this acute situation with some of these resources. But right now we're blaming all the struggle on these experiences when much of the struggle is not really knowing who we are or what we feel or what's happening in our bodies. And without that data, we can't move forward. When we cut off that data, our brain just starts to make shit up. It just think about in a relationship, right? Where you see a behavior, something happens, but you don't ask about it and the other person doesn't talk about it. What does your brain do? It starts to make up stories and guessing what's happening in the other person. Whereas you could just friggin' ask. Right.
So hold on, I want to take you back to that example. I was actually laughing because there was a conversation last night between me and my wife, who's also a clinician, and that totally took place. She was like, "Well, I didn't know." I was like, "Well, how could you have found out?" The classic
Right, exactly.
therapist asks that question a lot. So let's take that example of the kid being abused. Now he's an adult. Take me through, okay, so they're based on that negative experience, and again, not necessarily on a trauma focused idea, or therapeutic approach. So now they're avoiding the sense of being controlled or feeling out of control as an adult. And so what are we focusing on based on what you're saying now? Is it embracing it, or is it discussing what's your relationship to this emotion?
Well, yes, all of that.
Okay.
So it is like, so your every system is trying to summarize things. And so what happens is we have this summary appraisal of who we are based on the experience. And so, if somebody believes that they're not worthy of something and they're continuously trying to prove their worth, that's a theme that's operating, and guiding their life. And that's part of their sense of self and who they are. And they're constantly working towards that. And you can accomplish some great things, being motivated by not feeling good enough. But what happens is you get to the place where you've accomplished everything and that feeling hasn't changed. What's driving you hasn't changed. Gino Wickman, who in the business community, uh, just wrote a book. I can't remember, I think it's called Shine. And he basically kind of summarizes this process from all these high performers who have overcome all of these life experiences and done well in their industries and their careers, and they get to this place where it's like the things that matter the most, they're not doing very well in, because they're still just trying to accomplish. And you have to get to some of those things that set the whole thing in motion, which is often these themes. And it really relates to how we feel about ourselves. This is one of the reasons why it's hard for people to give up a role and how they see themselves. Part of my process too was, letting go of some of my roles, having some of these ego deaths. Like, for example, I used to be full time at the University of South Florida, as clinical director of this, and, training with the Army and doing all these different things. And so I saw myself as a trauma researcher. And, I had a career mapped out and was continuously putting effort into making that career happen. And through life circumstances, I have all of these other opportunities and these other things that I'm invested in. So just researching and sticking with PTSD, but I'm looking at all of these other factors, which led me to continuously train in all these different techniques and other things like that to look for the common elements. And so it took time and energy away from that. So just to make a long story short, it's like just being a researcher, I wasn't necessarily focusing all my energy on doing the research and doing enough to keep myself as just a researcher, because of my interests are so much broader. And so I had to make a decision, how much, am I really a researcher, or am I these other things? That's one of the reasons why I do a lot of coaching and stuff right now, is working from this other perspective, which I'll describe in just a second. But I had to let go of that identity. And it was the same thing too. It's like when I started to switch from being a university professor to becoming a researcher, I couldn't walk into the research setting as a professor and just explain everything. I had to adapt to this new role. And so I had to let that go. And so throughout life, it's like we will show up in situations like, you go through the selection process, you become a Green Beret. You can't come home and treat your family like a Green Beret. It's like we have to let go of these roles in order to adopt the roles in our current life and our current circumstance. So in working with folks on that, it's like, maybe some of these things developed as you adapted to survive in certain situations, but you've survived them. And now it's a process of letting them go and even grieving them. And it becomes to see that we're so much more than just these roles that we invest in. So my identity is invested more in just being who I am, and being connected, internally with my essence. And each new role that I create is one that, like, for example, with coaching and moving away, it's like, so my clinical work is focused on work in special operations. And that's a smaller portion of what I do. And most of the coaching that I do, I work with executives and do these different events. I also travel and work with Colonel Mann. I've had to develop this new identity, as Doc Diego, the human performance coach. And creating this identity is something I've been carefully shaping over a number of years, and doing it with the recognition that I will let it go. I
Mm.
will let it go at some point. This is not everything that I am. And so what happens is when we invest in an identity, we also have expectations with the outcome, right? And then when we don't get those expectations, then we're like, oh, I'm shit, I'm worthless, I'm nothing, I've failed, right? And what's interesting about the idea of failure is that really comes from the Industrial Revolution, where it's like we started to define people, based on their success in business. And if you're not a success in business, you're a failure. And it's just become a common part of our vernacular and how we end up judging ourselves as succeeding or failing when another way to look at failure is a prediction error. We predicted an outcome. It was an error. It was inaccurate. It was incorrect. And the neural pathways are open. What can we learn from it? But if you automatically feel like you're a failure, you shut down those neural pathways open to learning.
Mm-hmm.
So everything that I'm moving towards in my work really evolves around our sense of self. How do we construct something that's really congruent with our deeper self, with our essence and who we are? And how do we let go of those things that no longer serve us, which are even these identities?
So the question that's rolling around in my head, obviously we have to have some sort of goal, right? Similar to therapy, there's books, tons of books that talk about this. You have to have the end idea in sight if you're going to go plan a mission, if you're going to create a curriculum, whatever.
Right.
Come into therapy the first session or so, like, hey, what are your goals? What do you want to do when you're working with me? So we have to have the outcome or the idea. So I want to become a green beret, or want to become a law enforcement officer. But wouldn't it be more pertinent, based on what you're saying, that as a society, as parents, etc., that we should be raising kids to be focused on more lasting things, like, hey, what are the values that you want to represent? What are the morals that you want to hold yourself to? And yes, then there's this goal, and maybe with the set of circumstances and the values, when you pursue this goal this time,
Mm-hmm.
it doesn't work out. But we're not creating the entire identity, like you said, out of whether we achieve that said goal or not, as opposed to, hey, we're focused on what makes us us. And yes, there's seasons where we're a green beret, or there's seasons where we're a clinical psychologist, but then there's seasons where now we're evolving into an executive coach.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And a big part of those internal rules that we create, this is where we focus on our character and integrity. And these are things that are sort of like really kind of lacking in our culture, because we're always focused on, it's like how can we become the best speaker, and how can we do these things, and how can you make all this money in real estate by putting no money down, and it's like you can become all of these things. And so people are really drawn to that because they think it's going to solve something for them. And really, it's like the goal is to become more of who we really are, and to really kind of define who we are, what do we value, what's important to us, and form a life that is really congruent with those things. And because when we live in alignment like that, it's something is called integrity. And then we have peace. It's more about how we treat others and how we treat ourselves, and being able to formulate that. So when I'm working with clients on that too, it's like I have them start off with with their values, and what do they value. Who are you as an individual? What do you value? I use the Bushido Code as a point of reference. And so, as you know, samurais were also like Supreme Court justices. They were lawyers, they were negotiators, they were managers, they fulfilled all of these roles in society, but yet they had this discipline, they had these codes that guided who they were and how they spent their day. And one of the very first tenets, and I'll just paraphrase it, it's basically, I will rise up before the sun and I will confront my greatest enemy, which is myself. And which is both through meditation and physical exertion. And you find that throughout all warrior cultures, is I need to do the mental and emotional work every day, begin my day with that, which makes sense because the neural pathways for learning, you've just kind of wiped the board overnight, and you are most open to learning in the morning. So the time that you spend in the morning is the time that's going to have the most impact on who you are, how you see the world, and how the rest of your day gets shaped. So beginning with this stronger sense of who we are and what we value, that becomes the constant no matter what role you're in. And I'll bring it back to PTSD. And so what most people are suffering from is a disruption in that ability to update the self.
I want to come back to that just for a second. So going back to the society, and I've got young kiddos, I think that's a great challenge for all of us, especially those of us with parents, but we can all look around and say, this isn't necessarily the type of big C community that we want to be a part of with some of the things that are happening in our world. And, that's a great first step for the next generation of, hey, what can I do? Oh, I can get up, I can spend time with my kiddos in some meaningful way, but I can also instill and help develop the morals, the values, and the character that I know and I believe is going to help them, but also to be true to who they are in that development.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to kind of jump in there on that too, and it's not prescribing and telling people what they're supposed to do. It's being able to help them in their process of developing that and going forward. One of the things I'm grateful for, so I grew up in Detroit, I grew up in the inner city, and would sometimes ask
which high school did you go to?
Henry Ford High School.
I just have to say that because this is such a cool thing. When me and Diego met in person, he's the only person that I've ever met. My parents both went to Henry Ford High School back in the 70s. And so when we first met, there were just so many cool connections. That was one of them. Still never met anybody except for you that's been to that high school or attended that high school. I love that fact. Sorry, keep going.
Well, yeah, and then it's amazing how quickly the high school changed. So by the time you got to the early '80s when I was there, you had metal detectors, you had guns, you had gangs. My first day of high school, a kid got shot and killed in the doorway. I was in the middle of the shooting. It's like, welcome to high school. It's like, that's kind of the environment I grew up in. But back to my mom, because it's like sometimes we would ask about this thing that was happening. Somebody else's behavior is kind of incongruent. Not that everything was perfect in my family. There were some things that were great, though. Like, for example, our value system. And what my mother would say is that's what some people do, but that's not the kind of people that we are. And it's always stuck with me.
You were going to expound upon PTSD and how it connected.
Well, yeah. So some of the contemporary views too is looking at anxiety is projecting your sense of self into the future and trying to control the outcome. The past is projecting yourself into the past and in a way to try to prevent yourself from feeling bad in the present. If I had just done this, then I wouldn't feel like this and this wouldn't have happened. And then you're just freaking circling the drain rather than just focusing in on what you're feeling. And what you're feeling is telling you something more about today than it is about the past. Because this is the purpose. Our emotions are trying to guide us and help us to make predictions about what happens next in regards to what resources do I need, what, on a social level, all kinds of other stuff. So our emotions are really essential to our experience. So neurologically, you really can't separate emotions from thought. And many things that we attribute to reason are actually different emotions, right? It's like we've all felt that sometimes something wasn't fair, right? So it's a feeling. But that's also a guiding principle when people are trying to bring ideas and things and data into alignment. So it's an emotion that's guiding some of this behavior. A lot of things that we attribute to reason can actually be broken down to the emotions that have an influence on that, because it's hard to separate them. And what we've done as a culture is just we're not very good at being uncomfortable. And so so culture provides a certain context and guidance that we need around some of these things. And this is when you look at tradition and culture. I look at the different cultures and how they welcome warriors back. Like, for example, some of the Native Americans, which am also part Native American, is really important to me. Looking at some of these indigenous cultures, and how they welcome warriors back is they take them through this transition. And so part of some Native American cultures is like a vision quest. It's like you have to go on this quest and you have to endure these trials to be able to let go of who you were, to see who you are becoming. And then through the vision quest, you find your new purpose. You find out what your new role is within the community. And so there's a number of different veterans programs that are starting to recognize this need of context and culture, like like Sebastian Younger's book Tribes, really an important resource. And if you haven't read it, I would encourage anyone listening to read it. But we look at these cultures that have these traditions, and as human beings, we're designed to live in like groups of 100, 150 people, ideally, and to manage that. And as being part of that group and that community, think about how that works in a military context, right? You're basically in the ideal environment for us to relate with individuals, to have a meaning and purpose and value of being there. Yeah, that's why when people talk with me, and I work with other veterans or even people who aren't veterans, and they see stuff in my office. I have the creeds from all the different special operations groups. I've all kinds of stuff from my experience, and they're like, well, I'm not like those guys. And it's like, well, your nervous system can't tell the difference. It still experiences the world like those guys too. But everybody has a purpose. Everybody has something to do to contribute. Even with the folks in special operations, they cannot do what they do without the people who are supporting those operations, the people who are supporting their training and supporting. Everybody has something to contribute. And this is a big part of like being able to find our purpose is like, what are we really good at? What do we feel passionate about? And this is where people get it really confused because they're like, I'm going to find my purpose, but it's all tied into their ego. It's not really tied into their essence of what truly gives them joy, because we're so disconnected from our bodies. And so it's really hard to figure out what you're good at because you're disconnected from your body. So because we're disconnecting from our emotions and our experience, because we're being attracted to this shiny object, this other thing that we would rather be doing or being, which we believe would save us from what we're feeling at the moment. So the mechanism of change that and some of the research on trauma is actually showing it's the embracing, processing, acceptance of emotions that is the mechanism of change. Because the emotions are trying to summarize the experience. It's rarely the details in the experience. I mean, some of that sensory stuff comes in, but what happens is the more you focus on the event, the stronger each of the aspects of the event get. But if you focus on the summary of the event, the more that you can actually kind of move through it, because the event is coming up because of current circumstances.
I want to step back just a second. Culturally, there's a value in avoidance to a certain degree. I love your feedback on this. So I've always viewed physiological avoidance to a certain degree as a benefit. Not all encompassing, but sports, exercise, like there's really good benefits and feedback when we, are on the treadmill and it's like, hey, you got to run another 5 minutes. Well, deal with it. Some level of either embracing the pain or learning to avoid it so that you can achieve said goal, and all the benefits tied to that. But psychologically, the avoidance of some of the emotions or the emotions that we encounter, especially the important ones throughout the day, throughout the weeks, throughout the years, this as a culture has been a huge bugaboo, but specifically, and we can get into, even going back to World War II, but the GWAT era, this leading into some of what we know with post-traumatic stress.
So as a consumer culture, we consume pleasure. It's the pursuit of pleasure, which is a way to avoid emotions.
Or a pursuit of one emotion.
Yeah, or the pursuit of one emotion. Or it's like, I ride motorcycles and things like that. It's like, I like adrenaline to a certain extent. I like some of these things because they feel good. They're fun. But I also like riding with my friends and the sense of community and other things like that too. But any activity can become a way to focus on something as a way of avoiding other things. This discomfort is really, really essential to be able to develop the skills to process and to make meaning and to listen to it. Let's say if you have your arm tied behind your back and it hurts, and you're trying to get through life with your arm tied behind your back, the pain is a signal. Your frustration about your inability to do things is because you're used to using two arms. And it's a signal. It's telling you, hey, I'm limited by my arm being tied around my back. And then what people do is they just get frustrated and work harder and harder and harder because they don't want to feel that. And not wanting to feel it is actually part of the problem because we're ignoring the signal. So what we do is we prolong the process because we're ignoring the signal and we find ways to work around it. One of the workshops that I've taught for probably almost 20 years now has been the tactical use of emotions to folks in special operations and first responders and other folks, and create this context that every emotion is useful and has value. It's a signal. It's trying to lead us to somewhere. But it all depends on your facility with them. So emotions are like children, right? You shouldn't let them drive the car. But you also can't lock them in the trunk.
The other one that my grad school professor used to pound into our heads is emotions are like dashboard lights. They tell us what's going on underneath the hood.
Exactly. It's the idiot light. And so I guess it's also kind of a generational thing too. It's like some cars have idiot lights, and then being in cars and motorcycles, it's like I prefer a gauge because it's like I want to know how much gas is in there. I want to know what voltage. I want to know all these little details because when you're trying to make things go faster or run more efficiently, you need that specific data to be able to do that. And it's kind of the same thing with emotions. So. And this is one of the reasons why I call it the tactical use of an emotion, because you have to be able to not feel something at certain times to be able to achieve a goal or an objective or do something like that, because we don't always have the luxury of sitting down and reflecting on something. And for the most part, these strong things that we feel, we're not very skilled at it. And because we're not very skilled at it, it's going to make it difficult in that moment. So we have to be able to have the skills to compartmentalize it. But then and do a hot wash with your emotions after the event. And then you spend time with it and then you process it and you see what it's telling you. With a giant dry erase board here, and I kind of map this out with folks when I'm working with them. It's being good at knowing when do I lean in and when do I shift. So another feeling or sensation that folks have, let's say you're moving up towards an objective and something internally doesn't feel right. It doesn't feel right because your brain is taking in all this information, which is way too much to consciously be aware of, and has summarized it unconsciously and is providing you a signal that says something doesn't feel right. And sure enough, we get trained to respond to that feeling. And then all of a sudden you change your approach, and then sure enough, it was an ambush because you're reading something from that environment that was off. And so that's one way in which we're trained. Every emotion should be like that. when we get well acquainted, so that way you can lean in quickly, you get the data, you use it, and you move on. If you can't lean in quickly and it's too much, then you have to shift, compartmentalize and shift your attention, go back to your objective, and to be able to do that, to move through it efficiently. What happens is we have all these beliefs around emotions. That's the first thing someone does when they're speaking and they have a strong emotion. They apologize. It's like, oh, I'm sorry for being so emotional. And so I had that happen at USF once. I was giving a presentation on working with trauma with veterans. And I was describing this intervention that I created and the individual that I worked with. And I always get really choked up doing it. And then someone shouts out from the back of the classroom, says, oh my God, he's got secondary trauma. And I just kind of paused for a second. And, there was kind of like a big stir in the crowd because it was kind of like 200 kids. And I said, no. I said, I'm an emotive individual. I feel strongly. I love this shit. Pointed up towards the intervention that was on the board. And I said, every single one of you are here because you want to make a difference in people's lives. I'm showing you how to make a fucking difference in people's lives. And I'm proud of it. And it feels good. That's what I'm feeling. Don't be afraid of your emotions because they're trying to guide us. And it's important. You've had moments with clients or where it's like they've had some kind of breakthrough or progress, and you're feeling connected, and you feel proud of what's going on, and you're very aware of how much work that went into it and the risk that they took. And then I have a strong reaction, and I'm able to kind of speak to it and convey to them this. It's this social reciprocity that happens in those situations. The problem is like as therapists when we're being trained, it's like, oh, we should be a blank screen and not have any emotions, and this is all about the symptoms, and we're just going to come up with a treatment plan and treat your symptoms, and those are the people with problems. It's not very helpful. Medicine in that regards has taken over the human experience, and it's become the lens in which people look at their problems. So now they see everything as a problem rather than a natural part of life, a natural transition. And we're pathologizing everything. And so then we're afraid and we don't learn the skills that we need. This is the one thing I can tell you after 30 years of doing this, that the conclusion that I've come to is that in working through these difficult events with people, that the skills that they didn't have are what blossoms out of that work together. Some of these skills only happen person to person because that's kind of how we're designed as human beings, that it needs to be a human to human interaction to be able to guide someone through something. We're born like other mammals, but we are, take the longest to become independent because there's all this learning that needs to take place, and it needs to take place with another human being who can provide feedback, provide support, and we could take risks, and we could do things. Some of the research when it first started coming out about, you take the same battalion who've gone through similar events, who has PTSD and who doesn't. And what you see in the folks who don't is contemplative skills. They're high in their ability to self-reflect. All of these other internal things that we work with people, who are struggling with something. These are the things that allow people to make meaning and make sense of very difficult and challenging events. So this is part of the reason why I'm focusing more of my career on trying to make that more accessible to people. Because if we talk about these things more, if we emphasize the aspects of community that provide support and build those things out, and help people develop the tools and resources, there's going to be less of a need for acute care. Right now, there's a continuous reduction of these societal structures that provide psychological and emotional support and give people hope about the future. And then we're saying, oh, it's mental health, it's mental health, it's mental health, it's mental health. And it's like the idea of mental health was built on mental illness. working with people with schizophrenia and psychosis and other things like that too. And, and we've made, good progress in those areas. But the lens of illness is becoming a stigma because now it's so prevalent in our culture that that's what people are thinking. They're like, I feel bad. There must be something wrong with me. No, there's nothing wrong with me. So I'm going to ignore that feeling. Versus, we need permission to take the guidance from the wisdom that our body has, that it's trying to guide us. And what's just so wild is these things that we're kind of coming back to because of neuroscience, so talking about like Eric Erickson and Adler and these people who are talking about self-actualization and human potential and how our sense of self develops. It's like that ends up being the language that neuroscience is using to describe what's going on, because the language of mental illness doesn't fit the human experience. It may fit for a small portion of people.
I want to put a pin in the mental illness because that's where I want to go next, but a couple of things that I wanted to reflect upon. One, when you think about the human experience and having a role and having a responsibility in some tribe, this is, and then you take the military, it doesn't have to be special operations, it could be law enforcement. When you take an individual and squeeze them into a smaller community, a subset of the population that has unique billets for everything, auto mechanic, nurse, I mean, boom, 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 you get plugged into this ecosystem where your position, your job matters. Right? We're part of this greater team, like you've talked about, which then makes sense when individuals lose that. We don't have that on the civilian side where it's like, okay, you're in Tampa. Boom. Guess what? In Tampa, we need this as a community. And here's where we think you would fit. And, plug and play. Not that it would happen that way, but seeing how the military does that on a small system, and the ability to perform in that, do your job, be a part of a larger team, also work in small groups, identity development, everything that you mentioned previously. And I know I'm going a little bit back further in the conversation. That just makes complete sense. And I'll progress a little bit into what you were just talking about, tied in with emotions, and we can talk about the mental illness model. I would assume, and this is the way I've viewed it, and I'll speak on this for a second. Both my grandparents went through, or both sides of the grandparents went through Great Depression and World War II, right? So you've got that entire generation getting back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Like, they're just trying to survive, quite literally. They don't have the neuroscience, they don't have the research that we have, and so it makes sense that they defaulted to survival mechanisms for food, water, shelter, going into World War II, etc. And then you have a generation that lives through pretty significant events and then takes what they learn about emotions and about survival, rolls that into my parents, right? So rub some dirt on it, you'll be okay, knock it off, like, no emotional really vocabulary, what to speak of. I was born in the early 80s, closer to Generation X. And you've got, the 70s and early 80s kids that are coming out of that. But now we're at this point where, to your point and to what you're talking about today, this need, I would say, that as a society, and I would say as a clinician, you're echoing some of the things that I've talked with other people, is like a huge portion of our job is getting back to, hey, what was missed in childhood, specifically in, what Goldman talks about is emotional intelligence, but being able to name our emotions. Where do they come from? How do we see, or do we even see, emotions in other people? How do we respond to emotions in other people? And then how do we manage relationships, both internally and externally, is a huge part of what some of these individuals that come and see you and I, whether they're in the military or not, it's a huge part of it. And I will be gender specific and say males particularly, because our culture just doesn't lend itself, books, media, things we consume, movies, to educating us about our emotions. We've just taken, I would argue, going back to maybe my grandparents, of like avoidance of all emotions, and it's just hey, do said job, perform said task to attain, like we talked about, the identity, as opposed to now we're in this, I would argue, early adulthood of psychology and neuroscience versus medicine, anatomy, things like that. I think that's they're further along in their development to maybe middle adulthood. But as we're catching up, we're realizing no, these things are super, super important for a variety of reasons, like you're talking about today.
Yeah, they're psychologically, emotionally, and socially protective. And, in the sense of having that support and the sense of belonging and everything. Without it, um, it's when we look at culture, it's really, really interesting. I remember watching Ken Burns' The Civil War, and they would periodically go through the letters, and it would be like, "My darling Martha, today was the worst, was the most challenging day. It shook me to my soul." And there's the average people who are able to read and write are writing and expressing their emotions
Mm.
and expressing how difficult their struggle is and what is taking place and what their hopes are. It used to be seen as masculine, and it used to be believed that's why men are poets and writers and all these other things, and women are not capable of these things. But it became one of these things where it's like, as we went through these different crises with World War One and World War Two, other things like that, there's a couple of factors where this idea of being, American, um, it so a lot of it's the late 1800s, the eugenics movement, this idea that we're going to improve humanity, but the way to improve humanity is to create the nuclear family, and isolate people from previous generations. And so most people in the world live generationally. And so, it's unfair in society that we expect a woman to do everything when you have all of, historically in these societies, you have different generations who could bring, the parents bringing their support and guidance immediately, the grandparents, their wisdom and
Mm.
the things that they have, generationally, provides this support that actually helps rear children and things like that. And so the idea with eugenics was like, if you can cut people off from their heritage, and then we're going to create a new heritage that's all based in the new American ideals. And eugenics was to the point where even Hitler said that Americans are thorough with their eugenics laws, but Germans will be more efficient at carrying them out.
Mm.
So this idea is that we're going to shape society, we're going to shape people, we're going to make them this way, and the only way to do it is to cut off their heritage. It's kind of like what the people did with the slavery culture and other things like that, or with the native populations by sending them to schools and cutting their hair, forbidding them to speak their language. It's like we have to make people this neutral ideal. But what you do is by robbing people of their culture and their history, you rob them of their context, of their identity, of the emotional resources and other things like that too. So being robbed of the context and the culture of which to express our emotions is one of those things that's happened, in our culture, because it's like we don't have the history, the heritage. We don't have those sense of connection that is to provide some of that emotional guidance. And so and so you have that emotional, the vacuum of emotional instruction, at the same time of people trying to make everything more scientific. Where with myself, even as a clinical scientist, I love science, but some of the ideas in science, had strong impacts on people. So
Mm.
this is where the idea of the lizard brain comes in. So your emotions is evolutionary leftover. It's useless things that you no longer need. It's like your appendix. But now, even with the appendix, we've learned that the appendix actually plays a very important role in managing the bacteria in our digestive system that has a overall big, it's like, oh my God, the appendix is now important. It's like a different version of the spleen. But this idea that these are the things that are useless, that we don't need them, and so we've been kind of cut off in a number of different ways. One is lacking the cultural and our personal heritage. It's like, how do we know who we are if we don't know who we come from? Who are our people? Those things are kind of essential, because then tradition and other stories and things get passed on that provide us this guidance of what to do with emotions. So, you're seeing, like, during the Civil War, you're seeing people being very different because that's around the time with eugenics and stuff. And then gradually
Mm.
emotions, it used to be seen as something that gentlemen do, and it used to be seen as the height of a man is to express himself as well as do all these other areas. And that started being relegated to, like, the university and to the arts and things like that too. And as we've had different, entertainment, and we've had different cultural things happen where, we stopped talking about it. One is because culture provides the context to which to have conversations and to tell story. I mean, storytelling is so, essential to the human condition and how we make sense and meaning of things. I mean, it's interesting how the Vietnamese don't have the problem with PTSD as our generations have had after the Vietnam War. One of the main reasons for that is that the belief in the Vietnamese culture is that the story of the individual belongs to the culture. So there's an imperative to tell your story. There's an
Mm.
imperative to be part of it. Our men and women came home and were mistreated, and we told them to shut up. We don't want to hear it. And there were projects. There were films and there were movies, and those films started coming out in the 70s and the 80s, and people were telling their stories about what they went through. That's what we were exposed to growing up. Those were some of the things too. I remember the Deer Hunter, and then playing Russian roulette and things like that. And I'm trying to understand what the fuck was happening in my home growing up. And it's like I want to join the army, and I want to understand this, and I want to change it. I want to do something about it. But think about it. So we had the Civil War, all these other wars that happened. Then we have the first Great War, followed by the big pandemic, and then World War II, and then Korea and Vietnam. It's like every generation has been, at war with something. And each time it's like they're not coming back, sharing their experience and being part of the culture. People are being told what to think. They're being told what to believe because it meets somebody's political agenda. A lot of the people who put the eugenics into motion, they have a vision for what society should be like, and that vision is incongruent with who we are as human beings. And so we're suffering, and then it's easy to just say, it's like, oh, well, you're just poor stock. You've got mental illness. It's kind of like, some of the work, around palliative care in cancer. Some of the trauma that people experienced was through their interactions with the medical staff. And then you point that out to the medical staff, they're like, oh, they just need somebody to blame. It's like, without recognizing, it's like this human interaction that you've had has an impact on this person. There was this interesting study not too long ago with medication. And they had people hooked up to this machine that would basically dole out the medication on a regular basis. And then they had somebody who, like a doctor or nurse, would come in and inject them with the pain medication every so often, have a quick conversation with them. Who do you think did better? The people who had the interaction with the professional, even though it was a very limited interaction, actually fared better.
Mm.
Because we're human beings who are designed for human context. And we live, even our sense of self is in relationship to others. And it's essential. And growing up in isolation, from other people, robs us of the skills and the resources that we need to take on certain challenges. And then as a result, people don't feel equipped. So they don't make as much of an effort because they're afraid of failing. We need to fail and make mistakes in order to learn, and be supported and encouraged in those regards, because it's through struggle that we learn. It's through hard work that we learn. And these are the ways in which we become more than who we are, especially in these different roles. And this is one of the things that I love about, working with folks in special operations too, is because they've done that work. They have changed themselves. They've transformed
Mm.
through the process. And I want to support them in this next level of transformation, and always work to help people connect with their essence and who they really are. Because that is the center of us. That's what's going to guide us through these difficulties. And that's what's going to guide us through these different types of transitions that we go through. So to your point, the emotional skills are really, really essential. But part of the reason we don't have it is culturally. The other part of the reason why it's difficult is because of how we've kind of judged emotions or being emotional, looking at it as something that's unnecessary when it's actually essential to life, and it's essential to meaning making. Like when we do the storytelling workshops and we go through, prepping people and teaching them some of the skills, because going through a personal story and repurposing it to the benefit of others is a really challenging process. And you are the first beneficiary of the story as you go through. And being a trauma therapist as long as I have, what fascinated me about storytelling is as watching people go through the storytelling process in a workshop, see the same thing that happens over time in therapy. That people are coming to this level of acceptance and embracing their own experience and working through the emotions. And as they work through them, then they're the beneficiary of it. And one of the things I tell them is like, look, without emotions, you wouldn't have a story. And the things that we listen to in the story is the emotions. If you just gave me a list of everything you did, it would be freaking boring and it would be uninteresting. But if you tell me how hard it was for you, I'm going to listen.
Because we can relate. We know what that struggle's like, which connects us, which, to your point, again, why sharing our stories, especially our veterans, first responders, is so important, because of the connection piece, but also the support, the offloading. I mean, there's just so many pieces of that are essential. I want to circle back and hit on post-traumatic stress. I want to talk a little bit about the mental illness. Something you said jogged my memory. So you mentioned Vietnam, and just to give people a snapshot of where our profession was at. So Dan Siegel, he's a professor emeritus at UCLA. He was trained at Harvard. So when he was at Harvard Med, in becoming a psychiatrist, I believe, he was at Harvard Med. They were dealing with, in their rounds, I'm assuming at Mass General, individuals that had terminal illnesses coming back from Vietnam and wounds. And he left based on that exact discussion or principle that you talked about. He was trained, go in, tell them this is what's going to happen, you're going to die, and walk out. And he didn't accept that. He dropped out of the program, I think, for a year, came back and finished up. But his argument was, we as humans have to, even the conversation, we can offer them more of ourselves as humans. And I think that's what led into some of his research and him creating with, I think, his research partner, Alan Shore, interpersonal neurobiology, where they're throwing in anthropology, psychology, neurobiology, and a few others, maybe sociology, into that new discipline, because of the connection piece and it being so transformative. Not to go on a rabbit trail, but so as we come back to, us as clinicians, and I'll just say this to clinicians, but also to law enforcement, veterans, et cetera, that watch this, is a huge piece of our profession is taking a transformation, because the old medical model realistically did influence so much of the education in this field, specifically with psychology, saying you're here to pathologize. And I think some people have experienced this in the VA. I'm not bashing the VA. I think there's good VAs, good. It's all ran by people, but good people, bad people. It's come in, veteran. Let me hear your story. Very detached. I'm going to pathologize you. I'm going to give you this diagnosis, and then I'm going to treat you, or we're going to, and it's very detached. And I think there's a huge piece where, a lot of the research geared towards counseling and that therapeutic alliance that says, oh, actually how well we connect as professionals with our clients, actually there's a correlation of how quickly they get better, and the outcome variables that come in with that. And so a huge piece of our field, and I'm going to say all of the helper fields, are really shifting in the last 10, 15 years to focus on, hey, we need to do a really good job of connecting with this person first and foremost, because if that connection and that trust isn't built, we're not going to move them, or they're not going to go anywhere. Not that we're moving them, but they're not really going to progress very much. And so I just think that part is really, really key. And also for the veteran or law enforcement person, of, hey, fit is really important, just like at your job. So if you come and you find a clinician and you don't connect with them, please take another step, take another stab at it. There's great clinicians out there that understand your background. Some of them come from the communities. I know a ton of law enforcement officers that have now become licensed psychologists, counselors, social workers, etc. Obviously, soft network. We got a ton of former soft folks that have turned clinicians, but find the one that you connect with, because again, to your point, like that connection piece, being able to tell our story, it's so critical. But mental illness, I specifically want to talk about post-traumatic stress. So for those that don't know, I think if you were hiding under a rock, you wouldn't know this, but the vast majority of people, I think, understand there's this debate between post-traumatic stress disorder, so PTSD, versus this post-traumatic stress injury. And really the argument between the two, if I can clarify, and you can correct me on some of these, Diego, is one is a natural response, being injury, to an unnatural event or something that is abnormal to a certain degree. The other, post-traumatic stress disorder, saying or conveying maybe more of like, hey, you're broken, there's something wrong with you because you're responding this way.
I'm a big fan of Dan Siegel's work. It's so important. One of his most recent books, he talks about how neurobiologically it's really hard to distinguish between ourselves and others. So he calls it the moi. Like even our sense of self develops in relationship to who we are with others, and it's really essential. Like couples who are together for a long time, they develop kind of like a shared brain. They make up for each other and things like that. So this sense of connection is essential, and I think looking at disorders is a really great contrast for that, because the disorder is the problem of the individual. And what we've done is we've taken all these symptoms and saying, now this is a disorder, like post-traumatic stress is post-trauma. So post-event. And this is why CPT and everything else is focused on the event. And sometimes people don't really care about the event. They care about how they feel. The event doesn't bother them. But people go through CPT and they're like, well, we need to take you through the event. He says, I'm not bothered by that. I'm bothered by my friend dying. I'm not bothered by the event. It's like, okay, so your death of your friend is the event. No, it's the relationship. It needs to be grieved. It's like, you can't think your way out of it. It's like, you didn't think your way into this state. You're not going to be able to think your way out of it. There's things that need to be felt and fully expressed. I think that identifying post-traumatic stress or the level of acute need that someone can get to, has been a benefit. But I think that, we're still trying to identify the problem without looking at kind of the broader problem, the broader structure, and basically looking at how other societies do it, and they do it through relationships. So, and I know a lot of good clinicians and therapists who they go out of their way and are committed to building that connection, building that bridge, because they know that that connection is healing. But the insurance company only wants, all the things that make this treatment medically necessary. It has nothing to do with the individual's well-being. It just has to do with the economic means. So there's a big problem with the industry of medicine and psychology, versus the practice of it. And I grew up during a time where it's like my early trainings was in the 80s when the DSM-3 R came out, and the DSM was just a research book. It was for research. And so this new model of chemical imbalance was being sold to psychology, and we were being told, because it's like not getting the level of recognition as medicine, is that it's like this is going to give us the recognition because this is going to qualify us medically to be medical professionals, and medicine is going to welcome psychology in, and so it began to adapt and began to change. So many of the things that I was trained on have made me more effective than all the different evidence-based techniques that have come out later to address these disorders. And I can tell you there's times, in my training and in my experience where it's like, I am, focusing on the symptoms of this stuff. And I'm like, fuck it. That's not the problem. The problem is how this person feels. So let's talk about how you feel about yourself or how you were raised or what's going on. It's like, their primary concern is being manifested as these symptoms. But we don't get to the primary concern because we're too busy addressing the symptoms.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's assuming this, it's really, it's not a dynamic model of human experience. It's very Cartesian in the sense of like a lot of the research early on was looking for the organs, like when somebody tells you it's like the amygdala is the fear center of the brain. No, that was a hypothesis. There's no evidence for it. It's the routing center of strong emotions. We now know that networks regulate things and not the different organs. Like even the idea of it's a limbic system thing. And that goes back to the lizard brain. It's like, no, limbic was just a demarcation, and we know that emotions happen all over the body and that certain aspects that are related to the physicality, like with the amygdala, are a part of it. And it's like, it's our knowledge is emerging, but we're still applying the, the framework of these things that have been disproven. So again, it's like we end up pathologizing people, but then people argue, it's like, well, how do we know that they need care? Well, they're in distress. So, a couple of things that are emerging in that regards is like this trans theoretical model. Eventually, we're going to be looking at the network efficiency. Like, for example, with post-traumatic stress, somebody who meets the criteria for post-traumatic stress, there is a network that contains our personal narrative and story and performs many of the functions of the ego. It's called the default mode network. And this network was discovered because they were doing neuroimaging on specific tasks, again, to relate it to the specific areas, organs of the brain. And the brain was really active during this time. So over the last 30 years, all this data has come out and we've been able to basically build models. So the default mode network begins to form at the same time that narrative memory comes online. So around 5 or 6, we start to develop this network, and then it becomes more and more efficient. And then we're able to make a reference with who we are in relationship to others and who we are in the world. And that helps us to process information more efficiently. People who meet the criteria for post-traumatic stress, that network is operating somewhere between the ages of 7 and 9. Because we have all this comparative databases at the different ages and how well it develops and how efficient. So when somebody's gone through this event, and let's say that they don't have a strong enough sense of self other than their role, and they can no longer operate in their role, and they're saying, I don't know who I am. They lack that internal reference. Like when you look at suicide, you would think that it's like post-traumatic stress, post-combat, post-event, the person's killing themselves over the event. But you have all of these veterans who are never seen combat, who become suicidal for some of these other reasons that we have talked about. The biggest one is the loss of hope, not knowing who you are, not having hope for the future, being impaired in some way, and then not having the support and guidance that they need. Like one of the biggest interventions that people need when it comes to suicidal thinking and stuff is to be able to talk and express and talk about this loss of hope. I've seen this throughout my whole career. I'm grateful. Early in my career, I got trained that when somebody expresses a suicidal thinking is to spend time with them and explore it. And spend time with them and hear their concerns. But we kind of freak out and hospitalize people.
Right.
I've seen people traumatized by that process. And they're like, yeah, I felt like life was over and I would be better off dead. I didn't really want to die, but now I do after being hospitalized.
Yeah.
It's like, that could be a very traumatic
Yeah,
experience.
and why would I go talk to that clinician again when, like, the one time I even mentioned it remotely, they, called the police on me or had me walk into an ER when really I just needed to discuss it.
Yeah, and part of the reason is because we're defining it like it's a problem in a manual, and it's this piece that's not working. I had I have a newer Jeep, and I've worked on my own vehicles, work on my motorcycles, other things like that for the longest time. And I was having a conversation with one of the mechanics at the Jeep dealer, and he's talking about it's really hard to find an actual mechanic because everybody's been trained to just look at the video, look at the manual, replace the part. and people don't really have a good understanding of how the parts work together, because we're being trained to have these little specific interventions to track it, to document it, to keep the insurance companies happy and stuff, and we're leaving out the entire human being. And it's the human being that's important. And then what happens is the insurance companies become more and more restrictive on what kind of care can be provided, because they're like, well, that's not medically necessary. That's
Yeah.
not medically necessary.
Don't get me started on that. That was one of the things I mentioned to the SecDef when I got a chance to interact with him at Soft Week was, there's loads of research that shows the relationship between a husband and a wife, and the quality of that relationship and the functionality of the individual out in society, male or female, whatever they do. And I just mentioned to him, hey, if you want to support the troops, one of the things you can do from a policy standpoint, and I know it gets into insurances, but allow TRICARE to cover marriage therapy. And for those that don't know, the only way you could come in with marriage therapy and it be filed under TRICARE or any insurance, because I'm looking at my several copies of DSMs over there, so that's what I'm pointing at. It's not a diagnosable disorder. And so if you come to me or Diego and we take TRICARE, which we don't, but if you did, and it says, hey, I'm having trouble with my relationship, I would have to find some finagled way to say, well, does your husband have PTSD? If he does, okay, how does this relate to the relationship? And is that really the main cause you're coming in? Okay, then we can address it, because it's really about the post-traumatic stress and we can diagnose that, but we're also going to hit on some of the relational dynamics.
Right. And it's those relational dynamics are the key, because we learn those relational dynamics in the homes in which we were raised.
Right.
And we learned how to relate to people in intimate situations. And then that becomes the focus of basically our story and who we were. And then who can we be in this relationship? What can this relationship become if we allow it to grow and address those things that come up? Most of those things that, and one of the approaches that I use for working with couples is emotionally focused couples therapy, which is phenomenal.
Same here.
Get to those root pieces of it, the interpersonal, the relational dynamics that you can't diagnose. But these are the things that is like at the root of all of this. And when each person is able to kind of really accept that the other person's experience is valid because it's their experience, it may not be the truth, but it's valid because it's their experience, and then prioritize the relationship over being right. This is where we get into problems, because it's like when we want to be right, we're not doing the right thing. So if we do the right thing in the relationship by letting go of being right, we can actually be present, and then everything else is just a negotiation.
Would you say post-traumatic stress is really a violation of the sense of self? I mean, that's an oversimplification, but
yeah. So the event is the violation of our sense of self. And this is why it relates more and better with moral injury too, because this is a violation of our aspect of our sense of self. And what keeps people in that situation is the inability to progress, to process the information and make progress. Because any significant event we go through, it's going to change who you are. And we have to be able to let go of who we were and how we thought the world was going to be. I saw a motorcycle accident. Somebody pulled out, to make a left turn, and right in the pathway of a motorcycle, it was a young kid riding with one of his friends. And so all of their friends had come up. Me and my girlfriend went out there. She's also a psychologist. She's out there helping direct traffic and spending time with all the people on the ground who are, just make sure that people are okay. And the kid who was following behind his friend just sat on the ground saying, "It's not supposed to be this way. It's not supposed to be this way." I can't tell you how many people I've worked with hearing those words. That violation becomes of, the stories that we're writing about what we expect life to be. And sometimes we have to grieve those stories.
Yeah. The hopes, the expectations of that
Yeah,
when life does not match that.
yeah, exactly. Because life will not match that. It will change. Shit's going to go sideways.
Yeah.
And we have to develop these skills to be able to adapt to it. I sometimes am faced with something that I don't like, and then I'm reminded of in my brain of my own words. And it's kind of funny. It's like even one of my tattoos is built around the whole idea of just really not resisting change and embracing change because it's inevitable, no matter how badly we want something to be other than it is. And those are times in my life where it's held me back because of my inability to be able to accept things as they are.
Mm.
And as I've let them go, life changes and life opens up. And grieve those old selves, grieve the future I had projected, the future that I had wanted. And then make some adjustments because sometimes the way you want life to be is not a good fit for you. And then you keep repeating the same pattern and it's not a good fit.
Yeah. For the audience, the internal dialogue of a helper, psychologist, social worker, counselor, marriage and family therapist, it can be maddening to know so much about the brain and about ways to grow, and then to catch yourself on the other side of the couch, if you will, arguing with yourself of
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to do this or this is the way it should be, and then to hear your words come back and know, yeah, you're not the professional here. You're just the client. You're just the dude, and you got to do the homework just like anybody else. And if you don't, you're going to end up having blind spots and probably being a really bad clinician in certain ways.
Because that's a vision that we create in our heads as professionals that we're going to go in there and we're going to fix things. It's there's times in my like one of the things that I continuously work on is I have a lot of experience. There's a lot of situations where I have a lot to offer, but what I have to continue to cultivate is the skill to be open to what might be needed. And allow myself to attune to those things, and to be able to respond from that rather than my assessment of
Yeah.
situation. And that's just being more present as a human being. In order to do that, I have to be more present with myself. I have to let go of these stories as as me as the helper. I mean, some of the guys that I've worked with, sometimes, you know, I have people flown in from different places, or I get flown in and I'm going to work intensely with someone. And I'm like, look, this guy's about to be deployed. He's gone through this bad thing. He's having some issues. And it's like, this is a career changing thing. I see the things that are at stake and would feel the pressure of that too, but I can't operate from that pressure. I'm like, what's the best I could do for this individual right now? It's not my agenda to get them back on that deployment. It may or may not be what they really want to do, and that's why they're struggling.
Yeah.
You know, I had somebody I was working with that a few years ago too, and it's like the what they were feeling called to do was to become an instructor. They're like, I want to take my, and this person actually, got shot, killed, brought back to life. They like, I want to take my experiences and prep the next group of guys. And that's what they were really feeling. And they were really conflicted. And that's why the event of being shot and killed kept coming back up, because it was their unconscious mind telling them that going back there, wasn't afraid of going back there. But if you go by all the diagnostic criteria, oh, it's PTSD. He's afraid of going back there. No, it's a significant event that is providing direction and telling you you are not that person anymore. And who are you were becoming? You were transitioning. Like if you look at Joseph Campbell's The Hero's Journey, it's like you're going from Luke to Yoda. In your journey, this is part of the human imperative. Acquire as much knowledge and information as possible, and then share it. Prepare the next group.
Yeah.
Prepare the next people that are going. And that's where this individual was. And they ended up making that transition, and that was more congruent with who they were. Now I've seen guys when they get pushed and forced to go on some of those deployments, that's when things blow up, because it's like they're in this transitional state. They're transitioning from one for a reason, And just because they're really good at the job and they need someone to do the job, and then what happens is it blows up and then they get abandoned.
Yeah.
Because then it's a behavioral problem. But it's like the dude was right on the edge and you just fucking deployed him again.
That's the other aspect. You take individuals, not all of them have been, had some, I don't specifically speak about soft, but you take an individual who's an athlete, who's smart, maybe has some sort of traumatic or negative circumstances where they became really resilient. They find the military, they eventually find special operations. They've got an identity piece that's built into the military. They're really good at avoiding strong negative emotion, whether it's tied to physiologically, psychologically, and you roll them through a community where there's all these opportunities to advance in different careers and different, be trained on different platforms, get qualled in free fall, scuba, sniper, etc. Boom, right? All these trinkets to follow. But one of those things that I just want to highlight that you just mentioned is throughout a huge piece of that, they're not in control per se, or to a large degree, of what is happening to their career, which I can't help but wonder. We'll never know probably fully, but this has to play a part in them learning to shut off and ignore some of what their body is telling them, because this is what's required. This is what's next. This is what is needed. And then when it's not, this is a huge problem because they've always been told what uniform to wear, where the chow is, who's taking care of your debt, all these things. And then it's all gone. And a huge piece of even being able to identify what's important to them has been systematically, not intentionally, but taken away because you're a part of what the government needs and they tell you when and where and what you do.
Well, see, that's a recipe for any of us with burnout. When we keep
Absolutely.
going
Yes.
without listening internally to what's going on, and it just gets to the point where our bodies give out psychologically or emotionally, kind of give out
Physically,
and start making mistakes, start having problems and other issues. Part of it is because we're really not living congruently with who we are. Now, I've worked with other people who are maintaining a high operational tempo, and once we've worked on those skills, they have the contemplative skills, and so they're able to kind of think about their career and think about things going forward. This is where you and I intersect with talking about transition. It's like you need these skills about these smaller transitions, so that way you're consciously aware of the bigger transitions, so you can start taking action towards your future after the service or in the service in a different capacity.
mm-hmm.
Just like the SEAL that I was talking about who wanted to become an instructor, and that was actually part of his vision earlier in his career. He went, did the work, got the experience, and now he can enrich other people's lives and help them to be successful and to survive. But if you keep using them as a resource,
yeah, they're going to respond to that.
Yeah, you're just going to burn people out. Actually, interestingly enough, one of the some of the current models for some of the retreat programs started based on a program that came out of SOCOM. Early on in the GWAT era, because of the folks in special operations running at such a hard tempo, realizing these guys need some rest and you need some respite. It's the tempo of everything over the last 20 years just exceeded the capacity of previous tempos because they were shorter engagements.
Yeah.
Not 20 years. Actually, kind of so it came out of MacDill and it was over at Quantum Leap Ranch. And it was a mixture of equine assisted, some group work, some individual work with EMDR and things like that. And that became the model with the Lone Survivor Foundation after Marcus separated. So through USF, we worked with them for a time. And we're working towards replicating some of these models, which we're trying to address the whole individual, not just instructions, and that was also part of the conflict because in the VA, people were coming in. It's like, well, this is a medical issue. It needs to be addressed medically. And we're like, no, you guys got to stay away and let us work with the individuals, as a group. And it's been a really rewarding part of my career, especially seeing the growth of a lot of these programs and how they continue to do good is because they create that culture. They meet the social needs that individuals have to be able to process some of these experiences.
I want to let me check on the time, make sure we're good. Do you have a hard end date as far as time you got to jump off?
Yes. I'm sorry. I'm 3. Yeah.
Okay. Anything you want to plug before I let you go?
Here, let me check real quick.
When the new play's coming out, where maybe you guys have the date or the cities?
So Scott was involved with Operation Pineapple Express, and those of you unfamiliar is as Afghanistan was falling, the relationships that these folks in special operations and all these other groups had built with the commandos that we had trained, with the medical staff who were being supported, with the interpreters. And hey, there was a lot of contractors, even Americans, who were being left over there. And so these were relationships that were built. And so, of course, those people started calling, asking for help. And this whole ad hoc network developed out of it. And a lot of these individuals were identified as shepherds who were trying to make contact and connect people to help get them to the airfield and get them out of the country. And so Scott's book, Operation Pineapple Express, is about his experience over those 11 days. And then the latest play is called 11 Days. And so it's going to premiere December 17th. So it's 17th through 20th in Tampa. And I've heard a couple of the readings and stuff. It's really, really going to be phenomenal. And at the heart of it is addressing moral injury.
Looking forward to
it. And really, it's a way that addresses it collectively, going through this experience, seeing a coherent narrative of somebody responding and the response, and how it impacted people's lives.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
I was just going to say, I can't wait. I'm pumped that, obviously it's in my backyard, so I'll definitely be there one of those nights, maybe a couple of the nights, but that moral injury piece, as it specifically relates to that whole event and withdrawal and disaster of a withdrawal, I think I know the play is going to touch on a lot of nerves for a lot of people because they haven't had ample time to process some of that. And hopefully it will help a tremendous amount of people that get to experience it.
Yeah, that's our hope. And if there's one thing I could leave your listeners, is you have inside of you, in your essence, everything that you will ever need to be able to work through any difficult experience that you've had in your life. There's something within the core of us, because it's our essence. It's what drives us as human beings in order to survive. It's what helped get you through some of these things and can help you move through them, and have a life that is more meaningful and more connected with others. And it's a matter of connecting with the right community, the right resources, who can kind of support you and help you and guide you in that process, and teach you how to really access your own internal resources and strengths.
Diego, I appreciate your time. We're definitely going to have you back. I can't thank you enough. I'm looking forward to connecting again when the play comes out. But thank you so much for your time today.
Yeah, my pleasure, man. Thank you for what you're doing.
Absolutely. Thanks for watching. Please like, comment, and subscribe wherever you're watching or listening. And please share this content with your networks.